Hi, all of you. Welcome, all of you, for today's program, Sankara Academy of Vision lecture series for the World Sight Day. Uh, Thank you, ma'am, for accepting our invitation. I'd like to introduce Professor Ariela Gordon, SHAC, who has completed her PhD, and she's also a fellow of American Academy of Optometry. She's a chairperson of Department of Optometry and Vision Science, Hadass Academic College, Jerusalem, Israel. Welcome you for the program, ma'am. And Ariela ma'am is going to talk about risk factors for myopia. It's over to you, ma'am. Please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you. And I'd like to start by thanking the Sankara Eye Foundation for organizing this symposium in honor of World Sight Day and for giving me the opportunity to talk. So this morning, I'm going to talk about my research on the environmental and behavioral risk factors for myopia. This research is funded by the U.S.-Israel Binational Science Foundation and is in collaboration with Dr. Lisa Ostrin at the University of Houston College of Optometry. So today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the background of the etiology of myopia. In order to understand my talk, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Israel, and then I'll present the methods, results, and conclusions of our research, and we'll think about future studies. So what causes myopia? And why is the prevalence increasing? So this is a paper that let me put on my pointer. This was a paper from the Brian Holden Institute that has been showing the increasing prevalence of myopia in this century. And in this slide, we see years from 2000 to 2050, and we see the number of people in millions with myopia. And we could see in the year that this number of people with myopia is going up. The absolute number is going up. And not only is the absolute number going up, but the prevalence of myopia. We see in the year 2020, 2% of the population had myopia, and already 34% of the population has myopia. And we can see their projections that in the year 2050, 50% of the population of the world will have myopia. While that's not necessarily terrible, we also see a very worrisome trend that the prevalence of high myopia is also increasing. And we all know about the terrible outcomes that can happen that are associated with high myopia. Studies that have been done in the Israeli army recruits, who are about 17 years old, show a similar trend of, there were two large studies done, and the prevalence of myopia increased from the beginning of the century from like less than 20% to almost 30% in this one study. And what causes myopia? And this slide is based on the IMI risk factors for myopia paper. We know that there are a few things that have been shown to be associated with myopia, and I'll talk about them in a little bit more detail soon. One is parental myopia. One is education. One is electronic devices. And there's an overwhelming evidence in the past years that being exposure to daylight is protective, meaning the less children are in daylight, the more likely they are to develop myopia. So let's talk about them. So reading and near work and education. So there are many studies that show that in illiterate societies, there's almost no people with myopia. Myopia is extremely rare in illiterate societies. And when illiterate societies, when their children begin to read, we start seeing that their children develop myopia. And if we look at this slide that shows myopia in educational systems, we have them on a scale from educational systems with, the least amount of hours spent in education to the most hours spent in education, where we see it modern East Asian education, like in Singapore and Beijing. And here we see like adults in Gabon, in or Eskimos. And we have even, this is in India, so we see rural India, urban India. We see here the prevalence of myopia in percent. And we could see that as there are more and more hours of education, the prevalence of myopia goes up. So certainly there's something about children being in school that is correlated with an increasing prevalence of myopia. Parental myopia. So if here we show the relative risk of children being myopic, if either neither parent is myopic, and then we have a relatively low risk of myopia. If one parent is myopic, then we have, a moderate risk of myopia. And if two parents are myopic, then we have a very high risk of myopia. I can tell you an anecdotal note that both me and my husband are myopic, and we only have one of our 5 children is myopic. So I guess that, does not support this hypothesis, but, we could talk about this later. But, the difference in parental myopia does not change it doesn't explain the fact that myopia has been increasing in this century, because genetics have not been increasing. And in fact, what I showed you in this slide about education, societies have not become more literate in general in the past 20 years. So that would not explain the increase in myopia, especially in developed countries. So electronic devices. There are many studies that either support or do not support the role of children using electronic devices in the etiology of myopia. And, I'm sure parents of young children here are very familiar with these kind of pictures. We could see really young children, even babies, sometimes playing with electronic devices. However, the prevalence of myopia started increasing before electronic devices became popular. And I can tell you, I have 3 children in their 20s, and they didn't have electronic devices until they were in their late teens. And I have 2 younger children in their teens, and they had those electronic devices when they were much younger. So again, I don't think that the increasing use of electronic devices can explain the increased prevalence of myopia. So exposure to daylight, and I think this cartoon here really shows what is going on. Certainly it's my experience and a parent. My 3 adult children in the 90s, it was, what kind of child are you? You stay outside all day, stay indoors, come in and do your homework. And my 2 younger children, what kind of child are you? You stay inside all day, stay outdoors for a time. It's very hard to separate them from their electronic devices and get them to play outside. So perhaps, time outdoors is the reason that a reduction of time outdoors is the reason why myopia is increasing. And, there are many studies that show a dose-dependent reduction of risk in proportion to the number of hours that children spend outdoors. So in Israel, we kind of have a natural experiment going on. And before I tell you about this natural experiment, I want to tell you a little bit about Israel itself. So there's a television, there's a show on Netflix called Shtisel, which if you haven't seen, I really suggest seeing. And this television show is about ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel. And you could see them in this picture, the characters in these shows in their typical traditional dress. And I'm going to tell you about a study that we did taking advantage of a natural experiment in Israel that was recently published in the journal Optometry and Vision Science, Environmental and Behavioral Factors with Refractive Error in Israeli Boys. And I've included a QR code to this paper if you want to go into the paper itself. But now I'm going to tell you a little bit about Israel. So in Israel, we have a different week schedule than most of the world. Our weekdays are Sunday through Friday afternoons, and they're school days. Kids are in school Sunday through Friday. They go to school 6 days a week. And Saturday is what we call Shabbat. Shabbat starts an hour before sunset on Friday until an hour after sunset on Saturday night. And some of the Jews in Israel practice something called Shabbat observance, which is there's a special time of prayer. It's family time, and there's no writing, no going to work, riding in cars, and use of electronic appliances and devices they're not used. I should tell you that most stores and businesses are closed on Shabbat. If you come visit us in Israel, I always tell my guests to try to stock up on food before Shabbat because it's very hard to find restaurants or stores that are open on Shabbat. So Israeli Jewish society is divided into 3 types of cultures. There's the ultra-Orthodox Jewish culture, which you saw in the previous slide of Shtisel. They have distinct clothing. Their society is segregated in that they try to avoid, they stay within their own society, and men and women are segregated from each other. Men typically spend their days studying Jewish texts. They don't work in a traditional sense. They discourage modernism. They don't use the internet. They don't use smartphones. They typically don't have computers or televisions. And they're very Shabbat observant. They don't drive. They don't use electronics, and they spend the day with their family, and they study and they pray. There's religious Jews, and religious Jews mostly wear Western clothing. There's some additions. Men wear a skull cap. Married women will tend to cover their hair. There's no segregation between men and women, and there's no segregation between religious society and the rest of society. They work in all jobs. They embrace modernism. They use the internet, smartphones. They often have televisions, but they do observe Shabbat. So they will also not use electronic devices on Shabbat and spend part of the day in study and prayer. And then there's secular society. They wear completely Western clothing. They're not segregated. They work in all jobs. They embrace modernism, and they do not observe Shabbat. But as I said, Shabbat in Israel is very much a family time, and they'll spend the day, hanging out with family. So the 3 different parts of societies have 3 distinct school systems. This is a picture of ultra-Orthodox young boys learning to read. The ultra-Orthodox schools are private schools. The boys start school when they're 3 years old, and you can see these little kids are already learning to read. The girls start school when they're 6. They spend their time mostly learning religious text. They're segregated from boys and girls, and the boys spend really long hours in school. The religious school and the religious children and the secular children both go to public school. School starts at age 6. They have a core curriculum, which includes math, science, language, history. In the religious system, the boys and girls either learn together or they're segregated, and they have additional religious texts. And in the secular system, the boys and girls learn together. And you can see when I talked about religious people wearing typical Western clothing, but the boys wear skull caps. And just to show you, I know you can't read Hebrew, I'm just going to show you the kind of texts that children use in school. This is a text of the Talmud, and you can see there's very, very small text, different sizes. This is what they would be typically learning in the ultra-Orthodox schools. This is the Old Testament, which is also taught in the religious schools. And this is a typical 1st grade textbook that's taught in religious and secular schools. Okay, the last thing about Israeli society, as I'm going to tell you, is that there is mandatory conscription to the Israeli Defense Force. The ultra-Orthodox Jews typically do not serve. The religious Jews, the boys have mandatory service and the girls do not. And the secular has mandatory service for boys and girls. All of the children come in, all of the boys, that is, come in 11th grade when they're 17 years old. And they have a mandatory draft exam. The mandatory draft exam includes a health exam, and it also includes an ocular exam. They get their eyes tested. So this is a paper that came out by a group by Bez and and their colleagues in 2019, and it showed something absolutely shocking. This is the prevalence of myopia in the 3 groups of boys that I told you about. If we look at the global presence of myopia, it's about 30%. The ultra-Orthodox Jewish boys had over an 80% prevalence of myopia. The secular Jewish boys had only a 30% prevalence of myopia, which was similar to the global average. The religious Jewish boys had a 50% prevalence of myopia. The authors of this paper suggest that it's the difference in educational systems that's causing this large gap in the prevalence of myopia between the 3 groups. And if you think about it, they're all Jews, so it's not likely that there's a genetic difference between the 3 groups. Israel is a very, very small country. Most of its population is urban. So it's not a geographic difference. It's not likely to be food. So it's most likely to be something behavioral. And we want to discover the behavioral environmental factors that's causing this large gap in the prevalence of myopia in 17-year-old boys. So we had a pilot which aimed to quantify in ultra-Orthodox religious and secular boys several behavioral parameters. One is we objectively want to quantify outdoor light exposure and physical activity using a device called an ActiWatch. I'll tell you about it in a little bit. And subjectively quantify the children's behavior while they're not in school of near work, intermediate work, television, and electronic devices. And our hypotheses were that we would see objective differences in behavior between the groups of children. And we hypothesized the ultra-Orthodox boys would spend less time outdoors and less time in physical activity. And we also hypothesized that the parents would report that the ultra-Orthodox boys were spending more time at near work and less time with electronic devices. And I'll have a spoiler for you. Most of our hypotheses proved wrong. So what are our methods? We recruited healthy boys between ages 8 and 11, and we divided them into 3 groups based on the type of school system they went to, whether they're enrolled in ultra-Orthodox, religious, or secular schools. We made objective measurements of behavior using an ActiWatch. An ActiWatch is a device that looks like a watch. It tells time. It has an accelerometer, which measures sleep and physical activity. And it has a light sensor, which measures light in lux. More than 1,000 lux is considered that the child or the person wearing the watch is outside. Our protocol is we did refraction when possible. The parents filled out a questionnaire. The boys wear a watch between 7 and 10 days, and they return the watch. This is the questionnaire. It's based on the UH-NEAR questionnaire, and it was adapted to Israel. There's scaled items regarding the children's behaviors during the weekdays and on Shabbat. And I'm just giving you 2 examples of like the many questions in the questionnaire. Please mark the number of hours per day your child spends in these activities, outdoor physical activities, outdoor leisure activities during the weekday and Shabbat. The watch outcome measures was mean daily light exposure and lux, hours spent outdoors. And again, the assumption is that above 1,000 lux is outdoors, and the mean daily activity in counts per minute. The refractive status was measured when possible, and when not possible, we used a questionnaire. And the parents' refractive status was measured using a questionnaire based on Wheeling in 1996. In the questionnaire, the outcome measures were divided into near work, which was less than 40 centimeters, which included reading printed text, writing, drawing, and using handheld devices. Intermediate work, which was 40 to 100 centimeters, including card games, board games, and computer use. far work, which was more than 1,000 centimeters, which is watching television and playing console video games. And the differences between the three groups of boys were assessed by chi-square, Kruskal-Wallis, and Bonferroni-Post-Hoc tests. What are our results? So this graph shows the demographic differences between the groups of boys. There's no difference in age. But if we look at their myopic status, it's really almost shocking. Almost all the ultra-Orthodox boys were myopic. Almost none of the secular boys were myopic. And about half of the religious boys were myopic. And, this is statistically significant. But if we look at their parents' myopic status, there's no difference in the myopic status of the parents at all. So whatever's going on with these groups of boys, it's going on in their generation and not their parents' generation. In terms of the educational background, again, based on the questionnaire, the ultra-Orthodox boys learned to read when they were on average 4 years old, while the secular boys learned to read while they were on average 6 years old. And the ultra-Orthodox boys, there was a statistically significant difference between the age they learned to read between the religious and the secular boys. Again, in terms of how many hours a day they study, the ultra-Orthodox boys were in school significantly more hours than the secular boys, and there was no difference in their grades at school. Okay, objective results from the watch. This was very shocking to us because, as I said, our hypothesis was that the ultra-Orthodox boys spent less time outside, and the results did not support this hypothesis. There was this graph here, shows daily activity on weekdays, Shabbat, and all together the entire week. This graph shows the time outdoors, weekdays, Shabbat, and total. And there was no statistically significant difference between the groups. I will point out that on average, the boys spent more than 2 hours a day outdoors, which is much higher than seen in previous studies. Near and intermediate work, again, we thought because the ultra-Orthodox boys are more myopic, they'd be spending more time at near work. The results of the questionnaire did not support this notion. There was no statistically significant difference between the boys in terms of near work. There was a difference in terms of intermediate work, with on Shabbat, the secular boys spending more time at intermediate work, and for the entire week, the religious boys spending more time in intermediate work. Okay, electronic devices. People are saying that, they're causing your kids to be myopic. What do our results show with this small group? In terms of television, both for weekday, Shabbat, and total, the ultra-Orthodox boys spent significantly less time watching television than the religious or secular boys, and significantly less time using electronic devices. They have almost no television use and very, very little ultra-Orthodox, very little electronic device use. So what are conclusions from the pilots? Well, first of all, subjectively, the kids' behavior is different. They do have a different prevalence of myopia, with the ultra-Orthodox boys having significantly more myopia. They start to learn earlier. They learn more hours a day in school. They use less screens, and they write and read more. So even though the type of near work, even though the absolute amount of near work is similar between the ultra-Orthodox boys and the other groups, the type of near work that they're doing is different. While the secular and religious kids are spending more time with screens, the ultra-Orthodox boys are spending more time reading and writing. So these preliminary results suggest that this is a good model for a longitudinal study. They also suggest that early reading has a role in myopia development. And they also suggest that computers, electronic devices are not causing the increase in myopia, certainly not in the population that we're looking at. What are the limitations? We didn't have cycloplegic refraction for all the children. There really were a small group of kids. And I could tell you that we collected data until March 2020, when our experiments were stopped by the COVID pandemic and children stopped going to school for a year and a half. And we have no longitudinal data. What are our future studies which are being supported by the Binational Science Foundation grant? We're planning to do a longitudinal 2-year study. We're going to measure axial length, and we're going to measure working distance with a device called a cloud clip. You could see these 3 boys wearing a cloud clip. It's a device. I wonder if I have one here. I usually have one next to my desk that attaches to the glasses. It sends out an ultra, I have one. It attaches to your glasses. It sends out an infrared beam. The infrared beam bounces off the object that you're looking at. It returns to the device, and based on the time the beam takes to go out and come back, it measures working distance. So we'll have objective measures of working distance and not just subjective measures from the questionnaire. So first of all, I'd like to thank my collaborators at Hadassah Academic College, Einat Schneer, Ravi Daron, and Jonathan Levin. My collaborators at University of Houston, especially Dr. Lisa Ostrin. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. And this is a QR code that will take you to my website at Hadassah Academic College. And again, I would like to thank the Sankara Eye Foundation for organizing this wonderful symposium in honor of World Sight Day. And as it says in this slide, please love your eyes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ariela, for this wonderful presentation on your myopia research, which you have conducted, and risk factors of myopia very well explained for all the audience. And the eye opener of this session was the prevalence of myopia, which is going to get into 50% by 2020 or 2050. That's really a big eye opener for all of us. And a beautiful pilot study which is conducted in your country, where you have taken 3 different religious groups and you have conducted it. And you have found it in unorthodox group, the prevalence of myopia is high, and you digged into it and you have found out that why it is high. And it is not the electronic devices which is causing this myopia prevalence to get into high. In the unorthodox group, they get into the school by year of 3 itself, and they start reading and writing by age of 3. That is one of the factors. Can be prevalence of myopia is very high in this group. Also, you're planning to do a longitudinal study for next 2 years on the same topic, along with more details of axial length calculation and also a cycloplegic refraction and complementary to that. That's really a good topic to be, or a good research to be conducted. We are looking forward for the publication of this study. Thank you very much taking out your time and discussing about your research on myopia. Thanks from Sankara Academy of Vision. For all of the listeners here, please put up your question on the chat group. Any questions related to myopia, you can put up in the group. We will answer those questions in the chat box. At last, ma'am, you want to add up anything to this?
I would say that our advice for our patients and their parents is that kids should spend time playing outside.
Yeah, so that's very important message. So to spend more time outside than indoor. Okay, and thank you all of you once again, and stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you.
Thank you.